Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight, we drift into the perfumed, powdered and frankly pungent world of the French royal court, where the air itself seemed to have a texture. Picture it: gilded mirrors, silk curtains heavy with the weight of centuries, and beneath all that splendour, a smell you could almost lean on. Candle smoke, wet stone, unwashed wool, and human bodies that had not touched water in longer than most of us go without touching our phones. If you were transported back there right now, in your pyjamas, soft and freshly showered, you probably wouldn't survive the first 10 minutes. Your nose would simply give up, wave a tiny white flag, and retire for the evening. Tonight's story is about Louis XIII, King of France, a man who wore a crown, commanded armies, and yet approached bathing the way most of us approach cleaning out the garage. Technically aware it should happen, perpetually finding reasons why today is not the day. We're going to wander gently through his life, his palace, his doctors, his laundry habits, and the strange medical logic that convinced an entire century that water was the enemy. It's a story about class and comfort and fear dressed up as science. And it's stranger and somehow cozier than you'd expect.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing but a thumb movement you were probably about to make anyway. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with your location and your local time right now. I love picturing this little global map of night owls, all of you tucked into different time zones, drifting towards sleep together while I ramble about a king who really did not enjoy soap. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin, as these things often do, in a stone corridor. Not a grand ballroom, not a throne room dripping in gold, just a corridor, narrow and a little damp, somewhere in the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where a 9 months pregnant queen is pacing in the September heat of 1601. You can almost feel the tension in the air, thick as the tapestries lining the walls. This is where our story truly begins, not with a bath, but with a birth. The birth of a boy who would become Louis XIII, King of France and Navarre, and who would spend his 60-some years on this earth in what modern historians gently describe as a complicated relationship with personal cleanliness. You should know right away that this isn't really a story about one man being unusually dirty. That would be too easy, and honestly, a little unfair to Louis. This is a story about an entire civilization that had, quite sincerely, talked itself into believing that washing your body could kill you. Louis didn't invent that fear. He was born into it, swaddled in it, quite literally rubbed down with linens instead of water as an infant, because his nurses believed that submerging a baby's delicate skin in liquid was an invitation for evil humours to creep in through the pores. You heard that right. Pores, those tiny little doorways historians love to blame for basically every illness in the 1600s, were treated like unlocked windows in a bad neighbourhood. Best to keep them shut, caked and undisturbed. Imagine for a moment that you're a royal physician standing over the newborn Dauphin. Your job, an enormous career-defining job, is to keep this fragile future king alive in a century where more than half of children didn't make it to adulthood, and your best medical training tells you, with total confidence, that water is dangerous. Not just uncomfortable, dangerous. So instead of bathing baby Louis, the royal household relies on a method that will sound almost soothing if you squint. Dry wiping. Soft cloths, sometimes warmed, sometimes scented, run gently over the skin to lift away the obvious grime, while the deeper layers of, well, everything else, are simply left alone, trusted to the body's own natural defences. This mainstream historical fact, that bathing avoidance among European elites was rooted in a real, widely accepted medical theory, not simple laziness, is one you'll want to tuck away, because it explains almost everything that follows tonight. It wasn't that nobody in France owned a tub, it's that using one felt to them, roughly like voluntarily exposing yourself to the plague. And considering that plague outbreaks really did ripple through Europe again and again during this period, you can almost understand the panic. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you, tucked into the folds of royal record keeping. Some of Louis's childhood attendants reportedly kept detailed logs of exactly how many times per year, not per week, per year, young Louis's hands, face and feet were properly washed with water, as opposed to simply wiped down dry. The numbers, when they survive at all in second-hand accounts, are almost comically small by our standards. We're talking single digits for actual water contact across an entire year, for a boy who would grow up to rule the most powerful country in Europe. Historians still argue whether these accounts are fully accurate or slightly exaggerated by later writers eager to make the Bourbon court look extra grim by comparison to their own supposedly more refined age. Every generation, it turns out, loves feeling superior to the one before it. What you can say with real confidence is that Louis grew up surrounded by adults who treated water with the same wary respect you might give an unpredictable house pet. Fine at a distance, never quite trusted up close. His mother, Marie de Medici, came from an Italian court with its own bathing customs, slightly different from the French, and there's a lovely little historical tension there, a clash of cultures playing out in something as mundane as how often you wipe a baby's toes. You can imagine the whispered disagreements among nursemaids, the subtle politics of hygiene playing out in a nursery, decorated with more gold thread than your entire house probably contains. As Louis grew from infant to toddler to restless little boy running through palace corridors, his relationship with dirt only deepened, layer by literal layer. Court records, and yes, they really did keep records of things like this, describe him as an energetic, physically active child, prone to hunting, riding, and general roughhousing, the kind of childhood that today would mean a bath every single evening without question. Instead, that accumulated dust and sweat and forest grime was simply managed, brushed off, powdered over, tucked beneath fresh linen. You begin to sense, even this early in the story, that the entire French court operated on a philosophy of concealment rather than cleansing. Hide the smell, hide the dirt, never actually remove it. And so this is where we leave young Louis for now. A small boy in a very large, very fragrant palace, already shaped by fears that had nothing to do with common sense and everything to do with the medical wisdom of his age. Fears that would follow him, quite literally clinging to his skin, for the rest of his life, and which will trace further as he grows from a wary little prince into an even warier king. You find young Louis a little older now, maybe 6 or 7, and already you can sense the particular rhythm of a childhood spent almost entirely indoors and under supervision, wrapped in layers of wool and linen regardless of the season, because layers, in the medical thinking of the day, were protective. Cold air was an enemy, damp air was an enemy, and water, applied directly to skin, was somehow the greatest enemy of all, a strange hierarchy of threats that made perfect sense to people who had never heard of germs and who watched entire villages get wiped out by diseases they could not explain. So they reached for explanations that felt logical at the time, even if, looking back, they seem almost backwards to us now. Here's the mainstream historical fact worth settling into for this section. The fear of bathing among European elites during this period stemmed largely from a medical framework built around something called the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the belief that health depended on keeping these fluids in careful balance. Water, especially hot water, was thought to soften and open the skin, and an opened, softened body was considered vulnerable to imbalance, to disease slipping in through those newly loosened pores like an uninvited guest wandering through an unlocked door. You can almost picture a royal physician explaining this with total seriousness, gesturing at young Louis's arm as though the skin itself were a fortress wall that must never, ever be weakened. So when Louis got dirty, and by every account he did, chasing dogs, climbing furniture, tumbling around gardens the way any restless boy would, the solution was never a bath. It was a change of linen. This is genuinely one of the strangest and most consistent details of the entire era, and it's going to come back again and again tonight. So let it settle in now. The aristocracy of this period believed that clean linen worked like a kind of dry sponge, pulling sweat, oil, and grime away from the skin simply by contact, and that changing your shirt was, in a very real sense, equivalent to bathing. You wore a fresh linen shirt against your body, let it soak up the day's accumulated moisture, and then swapped it for another. The skin underneath was never actually touched by water, but the theory held that it was, in its own way, being cleansed. Try to imagine explaining this logic to a modern dermatologist. You can almost picture their expression, this slow, dawning look of horrified fascination, the same look you might give a video of someone trying to clean a window with a chalkboard eraser. And yet, for centuries, this was considered sound medical practice, endorsed by university-trained physicians, recommended in respectable household manuals, and followed faithfully by kings. Now, for a quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people, the amount of linen a noble household owned was actually treated as a marker of hygiene and status, almost the way we might judge someone today by how often they seem to shower, or how nice their skincare routine looks. The more shirts, sheets and undergarments you owned, the more frequently you could change them, and the more frequently you changed them, the cleaner you were considered to be, even though not a single drop of water had touched your actual skin in the process. Royal inventories from this period sometimes list staggering numbers of linen shirts owned by wealthy nobles, dozens upon dozens, an entire wardrobe built not around style, but around this strange, dry version of cleanliness. Young Louis, as the future king, would have had the access to an enormous supply, changed multiple times a day during periods of heavy activity, his actual skin remaining underneath it all, essentially untouched by water, for what could stretch into months. Historians still argue whether this linen-based hygiene system actually worked as well as its practitioners believed, and honestly, there's a reasonable case to be made either way. Fresh dry linen genuinely can absorb some surface oil and sweat, and frequent changes probably did reduce some odour and some risk of skin irritation compared to wearing the same garment for weeks on end. But it obviously did nothing for the deeper build-up, nothing for the scalp, nothing for anywhere water alone can reach that fabric simply cannot. You end up with a system that was better than nothing, technically functional in a very limited way, but a world away from what we'd now consider actual hygiene. Picture Louis, then, as a boy being dressed each morning by attendants, because royalty rarely dressed themselves. Layer after layer of linen, wool, and eventually the heavier brocade and embroidery that marked him as a prince rather than an ordinary child. Each layer had a purpose, each layer trapped a little more warmth, a little more scent, a little more of the accumulated residue of yesterday, the day before, and the weeks stretching back before that. If you close your eyes and really imagine standing near him during a hot summer afternoon of riding lessons, you start to understand why period writers so often mention scent. Not water, not soap, but scent, as the primary tool the aristocracy relied on to manage their own bodies. We'll get to the perfumes properly in the next chapter of tonight's story, but it's worth planting the seed here. Young Louis grew up learning, without ever really being taught it outright, that the answer to smelling like a human body was never to wash the body. The answer was to cover it, layer it, and eventually drench it in something stronger. This wasn't personal failing. This was the water he swam in, so to speak, from infancy onward. A whole society quietly agreeing that cleanliness meant concealment, that health meant caution, and that a king's skin, of all things, was simply too important, too fragile, too central to royal well-being, to ever risk exposing to something as reckless as a bath. And as Louis grows a little older still, edging toward the age where a prince begins attending court functions and standing near other adults for long stretches of time, that gap between smelling clean and actually being clean is about to become a very practical problem, one that an entire industry of perfumers, glovers, and scent makers stood more than ready to solve. Remember that linen-changing routine we just spent a while unpacking? The dry sponge theory of hygiene that governed young Louis's entire childhood? Hold on to that image, because now we're stepping into the minds of the men who actually engineered it. The royal physicians, stern and confident, who treated the human body less like a living, breathing organism and more like a besieged castle that needed constant, careful defending. You have to understand something about medicine in this era. It wasn't quackery practiced by wandering charlatans, at least not at the royal level. These were educated men, trained at real universities, following medical texts that stretched back to ancient Greek and Roman thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, whose theories on the human body had been taught, copied and expanded upon for well over 1,000 years by the time Louis was born. And within that long tradition sat a very specific, very stubborn idea, that the skin was porous, permeable, and that hot water, especially hot water, caused those pores to open wide, creating a kind of vulnerability that invited disease straight into the bloodstream. This is the mainstream historical fact anchoring tonight's chapter. European medical authorities of the 16th and 17th centuries genuinely, sincerely believed that bathing could be lethal, not metaphorically, but literally, medically lethal, and this belief shaped royal hygiene policy at the highest levels of government. It wasn't superstition whispered by servants in the kitchen, it was official medical guidance delivered by the king's own doctors, who saw themselves as protectors standing between their royal patient and an invisible battlefield of humours, vapours, and airborne threats that modern science would later reclassify as, well, mostly nonsense. But nonsense that felt entirely rational at the time, especially with plague outbreaks recurring often enough to keep everyone appropriately terrified. Picture, if you will, a royal physician's morning consultation. He doesn't examine Louis by drawing a bath and checking his skin. He checks his pulse, examines the colour and consistency of certain bodily fluids we won't dwell on too closely this close to bedtime, and asks about diet, sleep, and mood. All of it filtered through this humoral lens, where too much of one fluid or too little of another explained everything from a headache to a full-blown fever. Bathing sat outside this whole framework as an unnecessary risk, a variable nobody wanted to introduce into an already delicate balancing act. Why risk opening the pores when you could simply manage the body's output through diet, rest, and the occasional aggressive medical intervention instead? And here's where things get genuinely strange, and where our fringe tidbit for this section comes in. Some physicians of the era believed that a light, even grimy film on the skin actually served a protective function, acting almost like a natural barrier against airborne miasmas, the bad, disease-carrying air that people believed rose from swamps, sewage, and decaying matter, and drifted invisibly through cities and palaces alike. Under this theory, a bit of built-up body oil wasn't just tolerable, it was borderline beneficial, a kind of biological raincoat keeping the bad air out. You can imagine how convenient this belief must have felt to people who, frankly, were not eager to bathe anyway. It gave dirtiness a medical justification, dressed reluctance up as wisdom, and let the aristocracy feel not just excused, but actively responsible for staying exactly as they were. Historians still argue over how widely this specific protective grime theory was actually held, versus how much it's been exaggerated in later retellings for dramatic effect. Some scholars think it was a genuine, if minority, medical position, while others suspect it's been inflated by writers looking for a juicier historical detail. Either way, it captures something true about the era's overall attitude. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, simply wasn't the goal. Balance was the goal. Protection was the goal. And water, that seemingly innocent substance, was viewed with the kind of suspicion we might now reserve for, say, unregulated medication or an unlicensed surgeon. This medical philosophy didn't exist in isolation either. It was deeply entangled with the plague years that haunted Europe throughout Louis's lifetime and long before it. Outbreaks would sweep through cities, killing with a speed and brutality that made people desperate for any explanation, any pattern, any preventive measure that felt like it offered control over an uncontrollable disaster. And because bathhouses had, in earlier centuries, sometimes been associated with disease outbreaks, crowded, warm, damp public spaces where illness could spread easily among bathers, physicians increasingly steered their wealthy patients away from communal bathing altogether. Louis grew up in the shadow of this reasoning, inheriting not just a personal habit, but an entire civilizational trauma response, disguised as medical caution. You can imagine, then, just how seriously his physicians took their role. This wasn't a minor lifestyle choice they were managing. In their minds, they were actively keeping their king alive by keeping him dry, by monitoring every input and output of his body with an intensity that would exhaust even the most devoted modern wellness influencer. Bloodletting, purging, carefully timed meals, herbal treatments, all of it layered around a body that, ironically, was rarely if ever properly washed, creating this almost absurd contrast between obsessive medical attention and near-total physical neglect in the one area we'd consider most basic today. And so as Louis grows into adolescence, this medical worldview hardens around him like a second skin, no pun intended. He isn't rebelling against hygiene, he's following doctors' orders, trusting the smartest, most educated men in the kingdom, the same men entrusted with the health of the entire royal bloodline. It's a sobering thought, really, that so much of what looks from our modern vantage point like simple grime and neglect was, in Louis's own time, considered the height of responsible, cautious, even loving medical care. And it's precisely this careful avoidance of water that made the next great innovation of the era so absolutely essential to daily court life. The rise of perfume, not as a luxury, but as an absolute necessity. a fragrant, oily shield standing in for the bath nobody was allowed to take. Remember that protective grime theory we just left behind? The strange medical comfort in a slightly oily film? Well, even the most committed believers in that theory still had to deal with a very practical, very human problem. Other people could smell you. Medical philosophy is one thing. Standing next to your king in a warm candlelit room with dozens of other unwashed bodies packed in close is another thing entirely. And so the aristocracy of Louis's France turned, with real enthusiasm, to a solution that didn't require touching a drop of water at all. Perfume, in staggering, almost theatrical quantities. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. The 17th century French court relied on heavy, often musk and civet-based perfumes, not as an indulgent luxury, but as a functional necessity, a kind of personal force field deployed specifically because bathing was considered medically unwise. Perfumers held genuinely important positions in noble households, treated with the seriousness we might now reserve for personal physicians or financial advisors. Their job wasn't just to make someone smell pleasant, it was to make someone smell survivable, to create a fragrant buffer thick enough to hold its own against unwashed skin, unwashed hair, unwashed clothing that had been worn and layered for days or weeks at a time. Picture the scent profile of the era for a moment, because it's genuinely wild by modern standards. Musk, harvested from glands of deer, prized for its deep, animalic richness. Civet, an oily secretion from the civet cat, similarly intense, similarly musky, blended into perfumes to add depth and staying power. Ambergris, that strange waxy substance produced in the digestive systems of sperm whales and occasionally washed up on beaches, treasured for its ability to make other scents last longer on the skin. None of these ingredients smell on their own, particularly like flowers or freshness. They smell heavy, animal, and strong, which, it turns out, was exactly the point. You needed something powerful enough to compete with, and ideally overwhelm, whatever your body had been quietly producing underneath all those layers of linen. You can imagine walking into a royal reception during this period, and instead of one clean, unified scent, you'd be hit with wave after wave of competing, clashing perfumes, each courtier essentially running their own individual air freshener campaign against the collective odour of the room. It must have been dizzying, almost aggressive, this constant olfactory negotiation happening in every hallway and chamber of the palace. And Louis, as king, would have been dosed in some of the most expensive, most elaborate scent combinations available, prepared by royal perfumers whose entire reputations rested on their ability to mask a monarch convincingly. Here's your quirky, slightly unsettling tidbit for this section. Scented gloves became one of the great luxury items of the era, and Louis's own court was deeply invested in them. Leather gloves, treated and perfumed with elaborate scent blends, served a dual purpose. They hid the smell and appearance of hands that were, let's be honest, not being washed with any real regularity, while also signalling enormous wealth, since the tanning and perfuming process for high-quality gloves was expensive and time-consuming. Entire guilds of glove makers and perfumers, known as gantiers parfumeurs, built prosperous businesses specifically around this need. You could, quite literally, judge a noble's status by how good their gloved hands smelled, which is a genuinely strange metric of prestige when you sit with it for a moment, but one that made complete sense within the logic of the time. Historians still argue about just how effective these heavy perfumes actually were at masking body odour, versus simply adding another competing scent on top of it, creating something arguably worse than either smell alone. There's a reasonable argument that layering strong musk over unwashed skin doesn't neutralise odour, so much as it creates an entirely new, more complex and, frankly, more overwhelming aroma, something closer to what we might now call a scent collision than an actual solution. But whether or not it truly worked in the way people believed, the social function of perfume was arguably more important than its practical one. Wearing an elaborate, expensive scent signalled that you cared, that you were making an effort within the boundaries your era considered safe and sensible, that you respected the people around you enough to at least attempt to manage the situation. Louis's own relationship with perfume, based on surviving court records and household expense accounts, appears to have been somewhat restrained compared to some of his more famously flamboyant contemporaries. He wasn't known as a flashy dresser or an eager consumer of luxury goods in the way some later French kings would become legendary for. Still, even a modest royal perfume budget by the standards of Louis's court would represent an enormous expenditure by any ordinary household's measure, funding regular deliveries of scented waters, oils and powders meant to be applied directly to skin, hair and clothing alike. And it's worth pausing here to imagine the actual application process, because it wasn't as simple as a quick spray the way we might think of perfume today. Scented oils and waters were often rubbed directly onto pulse points, dabbed into wigs and hair, sprinkled onto clothing, and even infused into the wax used for sealing letters, so that a written message from a nobleman might arrive already carrying a hint of his signature scent. Fans, too, were frequently perfumed, giving their owners a portable wafting cloud of fragrance they could deploy with a simple flick of the wrist whenever the surrounding air grew a bit too honest for comfort. So as you picture Louis moving through his palace, trailed by the rich, heavy scent of musk and ambergris, understand that this wasn't vanity in the way we might assume today. It was survival strategy, dressed up in gold thread and delivered by royal perfumers who understood better than anyone that in a world where bathing was feared and linen could only do so much, the only remaining line of defence was scent thick enough to hold the entire court together, right up until the moment someone got just a little too close and the whole fragrant illusion started to falter. You remember that linen-changing routine from earlier, the one we called the dry sponge theory, where fresh shirts stood in for actual bathing? It's time to return to it properly now, because this wasn't just a childhood habit young Louis eventually outgrew. It was the backbone of adult aristocratic hygiene for his entire life, refined and formalised into something almost ritualistic by the time he sat on the throne. Here's the mainstream historical fact anchoring this chapter. The linen shirt, worn directly against the skin and changed frequently throughout the day, was considered the primary tool of personal hygiene among the European elite for much of the 16th and 17th centuries, effectively replacing water-based bathing as the standard method of managing body odour and skin oils. This wasn't a workaround or a compromise. It was the actual accepted system, taught in etiquette manuals, discussed by physicians and practiced with real discipline by anyone who could afford enough linen to make it work. Think about what this actually required logistically. A single nobleman or noblewoman of Louis's court might change their undershirt 2, 3, even 4 times in a single day, depending on activity level and the heat of the season. Each change meant an entirely fresh piece of fine linen, laundered separately, often scented, and pressed into careful folds by household staff whose entire job revolved around maintaining this rotation. For a king, multiply that logistical operation by an entire royal household. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of linen garments moving constantly between wear, laundry and storage, a whole invisible infrastructure of washerwomen and laundresses working around the clock, not to clean bodies, but to clean the fabric that stood between bodies and the outside world. Picture the laundering process itself for a moment, because it's genuinely fascinating and a little grim by modern standards. Linen was typically washed in large basins using lye soap, made from animal fat and wood ash, a harsh, strong-smelling substance that would strip fabric clean even without modern detergents. After washing, linens were often laid out on grass to dry and bleach naturally in the sun, a practice called grassing or bucking, which could take hours or even days depending on weather. Then came the pressing, the folding, the careful storage in chests often lined with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender to keep the fabric fresh until it was needed again. It was an enormous amount of labour, all in service of a garment that would touch skin for only a matter of hours before being swapped out again. Now here's your quirky tidbit, and it's a genuinely delightful bit of historical trivia. The whiteness of your linen became a direct marker of your social status, arguably even more important visually than the quality of your outer clothing. A crisp, bright white shirt collar or cuff peeking out from beneath a doublet signalled wealth and cleanliness in a way that was instantly visually legible to everyone around you, the way a certain brand of watch or handbag might signal status today. Nobles competed quietly but genuinely over whose linen looked cleanest, whitest, most impeccably maintained, even though, and this is the part that always gets me, none of it reflected the condition of the skin actually underneath. You can imagine Louis, dressed each morning in a fresh, brilliantly white linen shirt, the fabric crisp and cool against skin that had, in all likelihood, not been touched by water in weeks. The visual effect from across a room would have been immaculate. A king who appeared by every outward signal his court understood to be the picture of cleanliness and refinement. It's a strange kind of performance, isn't it? This elaborate system built entirely around appearing clean rather than actually being clean. And yet it worked, at least well enough to sustain an entire social hierarchy for generations. Historians still argue about just how much odour control this linen system genuinely provided in practice. Fresh linen absolutely can absorb some surface moisture and oil, and frequent changes likely did reduce some of the harsher edges of body odour, compared to wearing a single garment for extended periods without any change at all. But it's worth remembering that this system did nothing for hair, nothing for feet tucked into shoes and stockings for entire days, nothing for the accumulated grime in creases and folds of skin that fabric alone simply cannot reach, no matter how frequently it's swapped. The linen system was, at best, a partial surface-level solution wrapped in the language of complete hygiene. There's also a fascinating class dimension buried in all of this that's worth sitting with for a moment. This entire linen-based system only worked if you had access to an enormous quantity of fabric and an army of laundry staff to maintain it. Ordinary people, peasants and labourers who made up the vast majority of the population simply didn't have this option. They owned far fewer garments, changed them far less frequently, and lived with a level of accumulated body odour that the aristocracy would have found genuinely shocking, even as the aristocracy's own actual skin, hidden beneath crisp white linen, was arguably not all that different underneath. Cleanliness in this era was as much a performance of wealth as it was any real physical state, a visible costume worn over a much messier, much more universal human reality. And as we sit with that thought for a moment, the gap between how clean Louis's court appeared and how clean it actually was, it's worth remembering that fabric and linen could only manage so much, because underneath all those fresh white shirts, an entirely different kind of resident had made itself very comfortably at home, and it's time we talked about them. Remember all that crisp white linen we just spent a while admiring, changed so carefully, laundered so meticulously? Here's the uncomfortable truth waiting underneath it. Fresh fabric or not, Louis's court was absolutely teeming with parasites, and lice and fleas were simply an accepted, unremarkable part of daily aristocratic life, as ordinary and unavoidable as catching a cold. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter, and it's one that tends to genuinely surprise people. Lice infestation was so common among the European nobility of this period that it was barely even considered noteworthy, let alone shameful. Wigs, elaborate hairstyles and heavy layered clothing created ideal conditions for lice to thrive, and without regular washing of hair or scalp, infestations could persist for months, passed easily between courtiers who spent their days in close physical proximity, sharing furniture, embracing in greeting and sitting shoulder to shoulder through hours of court ceremony. Picture the practical response to this, because it's oddly charming in its own grim way. Rather than treating lice as a hygiene failure requiring bathing, the court developed an entire specialised industry of anti-lice tools and accessories. Fine-toothed combs, carved from ivory, bone or wood, became essential daily items, used to comb through hair each morning in an attempt to physically remove lice and their eggs, called nits, without ever touching water to the scalp. Some of these combs, preserved in museums today, are genuinely beautiful objects, ornately carved, clearly treasured possessions rather than shameful medical necessities. You kept your comb close, used it often, and simply accepted that this was part of your daily grooming routine, no different from brushing your teeth might feel to us. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to delight people once they hear it. Small decorative boxes, sometimes called flea traps, or flea furs, became genuine fashion accessories among wealthy women of this broader era, worn draped around the neck or tucked into clothing. These were often small pieces of fur, sometimes fashioned into the shape of an animal with a jewelled head, designed on the theory that fleas would preferentially jump onto the fur rather than onto the wearer's skin, essentially acting as a decoy. Whether this actually worked as intended is genuinely debated by historians, but the fact that fashionable society developed elaborate jewelled accessories specifically to manage flea infestations tells you almost everything you need to know about how normalised these parasites were in daily elite life. Louis himself, according to various court accounts and the writings of contemporaries, was not spared from this reality. Descriptions of the broader court environment during his reign reference lice and fleas as a persistent background nuisance, something managed rather than eliminated, treated with the same weary acceptance you might apply to mosquitoes at a summer picnic today. Servants would have been tasked with regularly checking and combing the king's hair and wigs, a quiet, constant maintenance task performed behind the scenes, rarely documented in detail because it was simply too mundane, too routine, to warrant special mention in the grander historical record. Historians still argue about the true scale of lice infestation among specifically the highest tier of royalty, since surviving records tend to focus on political events, military campaigns, and religious matters rather than the granular details of who was personally infested and to what degree. Some historians believe royal households, with slightly more resources for laundering and grooming than the general aristocracy, likely experienced somewhat lower infestation rates, while others point out that shared wigs, borrowed clothing during travel, and close contact with a wide circle of courtiers, servants, and visitors would have made complete avoidance essentially impossible regardless of wealth. What's clear is that nobody, not even a king, existed entirely outside this ecosystem of small, persistent, itchy companions. It's worth pausing here to think about wigs specifically, because they play such a significant role in this story. As wig wearing became increasingly fashionable through the 17th century, especially as hair loss and hygiene concerns pushed more elite men toward wearing elaborate hairpieces rather than styling their natural hair, these wigs created entirely new habitats for lice to establish themselves. Wigs were rarely washed with any real frequency. Cleaning them involved delicate, expensive processes that could damage the material, so most wig owners relied instead on powders, perfumes, and the occasional careful combing to manage both odour and infestation. A wig, once established as a comfortable home for lice, could remain that way for extended periods, quietly worn atop a head that believed itself, at least outwardly, perfectly presentable. There's a genuinely poignant, slightly absurd image worth sitting with here. Imagine a formal court gathering, dozens of the most powerful and wealthy people in France, dressed in silk and gold thread, discussing matters of state and diplomacy with total seriousness and dignity, while beneath their wigs and layered clothing, an entirely separate ecosystem of tiny uninvited guests goes about its own business, utterly indifferent to titles or crowns. It's a wonderfully humanizing detail, isn't it? This reminder that no amount of political power, wealth, or ceremony could fully insulate anyone, even a king, from the small, persistent realities of the physical body. And so, having spent some time in the company of Louis's Lice and Fleas, it feels only right to turn our attention now to the man himself a bit more directly, and to see what the actual surviving records, court diaries, physicians' notes, and the observations of ambassadors and visitors tell us specifically about Louis XIII's own personal grooming habits, separate from the broader customs of his court and his century. Remember those lice combs we just left behind, tucked away in some drawer near Louis's dressing chamber? It's time now to look more directly at the man himself, because we've spent 6 chapters building up the broader medical and social context of his era, and Louis deserves his own close-up. What do we actually know from surviving records about his personal individual approach to hygiene, separate from the general customs of his court? This is the mainstream historical fact worth settling into here. Several surviving accounts from courtiers, ambassadors, and physicians who spent time close to Louis describe him as notably reserved, austere, and even somewhat indifferent to personal luxury and physical comfort compared to many of his contemporaries, a temperament that extended into how he approached his own body and grooming. Louis was, by most accounts, a fairly serious, melancholic figure, deeply religious, more interested in hunting, music, and matters of state than in the elaborate personal indulgences that some other European monarchs of the era embraced. This temperament seems to have shaped his hygiene habits as much as, or perhaps even more than, the general medical fears of his century. Picture Louis as a young king, having ascended to the throne at just 8 years old following his father Henry IV's assassination, growing up under the regency of his mother, Marie de Medici, in an atmosphere thick with political tension and court intrigue. From what survives in historical accounts, young Louis showed relatively little interest in the elaborate fashion and personal display that defined much of aristocratic culture around him. He preferred simpler clothing, practical pursuits like hunting and metalworking, and by several contemporary descriptions seemed almost uncomfortable with the theatrical, performative aspects of royal presentation that so many of his courtiers embraced enthusiastically. This matters for our story because it suggests Louis may have approached even the era's standard hygiene rituals, the linen changes, the perfuming, the powdering, with a certain reluctance or minimalism compared to the full elaborate treatment some nobles indulged in. Several accounts describe him as preferring plainer, more practical dress, and there are suggestions in some historical writing that he found excessive perfuming and elaborate grooming rituals somewhat tedious, tolerating them as royal obligation rather than embracing them with personal enthusiasm. Here's a quirky, genuinely interesting tidbit for this section. Louis reportedly enjoyed working with his hands in ways considered rather unusual for a king, including activities like gardening, cooking simple dishes, and even basic blacksmithing and locksmithing, hobbies that would have left him considerably dirtier, more sweaty, and more physically grimy than the average courtier who spent their days in more sedentary pursuits. A king voluntarily engaging in manual labour as a hobby was, in itself, a fairly eccentric choice for the era, and it would have meant Louis's body accumulated the kind of everyday, practical dirt that his more decorative courtiers might have rarely encountered, layered right on top of the era's general reluctance toward bathing. Historians still argue about how much weight to put on individual anecdotes describing Louis's personal habits, since much of what survives comes through the filtered, sometimes politically motivated writing of memoirists and courtiers who had their own reasons for portraying the king in particular ways, whether flatteringly austere and pious, or unflatteringly cold and withdrawn. Some historians caution against reading too much personal detail into court accounts, primarily concerned with political manoeuvring rather than domestic minutiae, while others argue that the consistency of certain descriptions across multiple independent sources lends them real credibility. What does seem reasonably well supported is that Louis suffered from various chronic health issues throughout his life, digestive problems, respiratory troubles, and periods of significant illness, which meant his physicians paid extremely close attention to his physical condition, likely including detailed monitoring of his skin, his linens, and general bodily maintenance as part of managing his broader health. This medical attention, ironic as it sounds, may have meant Louis's hygiene was actually more closely monitored and managed than that of many of his courtiers, even if hygiene in this context meant careful management of humours and linens, rather than anything resembling a regular bath. There's also the matter of Louis's documented personal discipline and religious devotion, which shaped much of his daily routine. He was known for rigorous prayer schedules, relatively simple meals compared to the excesses some expected of French royalty, and a generally austere personal philosophy that valued restraint over indulgence. It's entirely plausible, and several historians have suggested this, that Louis's approach to grooming reflected this same restrained temperament, attending to the basic, medically sanctioned rituals of his era, the linen changes, the occasional light perfuming, without embracing the more elaborate decorative excess that some of his contemporaries, and certainly some later French monarchs, would become famous for. Picture him then, not as a king wallowing in filth out of laziness or indifference, but as a genuinely complicated figure, austere, religious, physically active in unusually practical ways for someone of his station, managed closely by physicians due to chronic illness, and shaped by a medical and social framework that made regular bathing simply unthinkable, regardless of his personal preferences. It's a more nuanced picture than the simple, gross unwashed king caricature that sometimes circulates in popular retellings of this era, and it's worth holding on to that nuance as we move forward, because next we're going to step directly into the physician's chambers with him, and take a much closer look at exactly what his daily medical routine actually involved: the bloodletting, the purges, the enemas that stood in, quite seriously, as substitutes for the hygiene we'd recognise today, forming a bizarre parallel system of bodily maintenance that Louis endured with a regularity that might genuinely shock you. Remember that austere, dutiful side of Louis we just spent time with? The king who tolerated grooming rituals rather than revelling in them? Well, if there's one part of his daily routine he could not avoid, could not delegate away, and apparently endured with genuinely remarkable frequency, it was medical treatment. And by treatment, we mean the era's peculiar substitute for hygiene: bloodletting, purging, and enemas, administered with a regularity that modern readers tend to find almost unbelievable. This is the mainstream historical fact anchoring tonight's chapter, and it's genuinely well documented. Louis XIII underwent an extraordinary number of medical bloodlettings and purges throughout his life, with some historical estimates suggesting hundreds of bloodletting sessions and even more numerous enemas across his lifetime, all administered by his personal physicians as standard preventive and curative care. Royal account books and physicians' journals from the period, some of which survive in reasonable detail, describe a king whose body was subjected to constant medical intervention, all rooted in that same humoral theory we discussed earlier. The idea that health depended on carefully balancing the body's fluids, and that excess blood, excess bile, or general imbalance needed to be physically drained or expelled to restore proper equilibrium. Picture the actual process for a moment, because it's worth understanding in some detail. Bloodletting typically involved a physician making a small incision, often at the arm, and allowing a measured amount of blood to drain into a basin, sometimes using leeches instead of a blade, depending on the physician's preference and the specific ailment being treated. This wasn't a rare, desperate measure reserved for serious illness. For Louis, it appears to have been almost routine maintenance, performed regularly even when he wasn't showing obvious signs of sickness, as a kind of preventive tune-up for a body his physicians believed was constantly at risk of falling out of balance. Enemas, meanwhile, were administered with similarly startling frequency, using a device called a clister, essentially a syringe-like tool that delivered various herbal or medicinal liquid mixtures directly into the lower digestive tract, intended to purge the body of excess or corrupted matter believed to be causing illness or imbalance. Some historical accounts suggest Louis underwent enemas dozens, even hundreds of times across certain periods of his life, treated as a completely normal part of royal medical care rather than anything embarrassing or unusual. Here's a quirky, genuinely startling tidbit that tends to stick with people. Some historical estimates, drawn from surviving physicians' records, suggest Louis may have undergone bloodletting or purging treatments as often as several times a month during certain stretches of his reign, and cumulative lifetime estimates from some historians run into the many hundreds of individual procedures. When you actually sit with that number, it becomes almost hard to imagine. A body subjected to that much repeated invasive medical intervention, all administered with total sincerity by physicians who believed they were providing the very best care available, the medical equivalent of a rigorous modern wellness routine just aimed in a completely different, and to our eyes rather alarming direction. Historians still argue about the precise numbers involved, since surviving records from this period are inconsistent, sometimes contradictory, and filtered through physicians who had their own professional incentives to document their diligence and thoroughness. Some historians believe popularly cited figures for the total number of Louis's bloodlettings and purges over his lifetime may be somewhat inflated or drawn from selective record-keeping, while others argue that even conservative estimates still represent an extraordinary level of routine invasive medical treatment by any standard, ancient or modern. Regardless of the exact final tally, there's broad consensus that Louis's medical care involved this kind of intervention far more frequently than would be recommended or even considered remotely safe by modern medical understanding. It's worth pausing to consider what this meant for Louis's actual physical experience of hygiene and bodily maintenance, because it reframes the whole picture in an interesting way. While his skin rarely encountered water, his body was nonetheless subjected to constant, intimate medical attention, his blood examined, his digestive output scrutinized, his overall condition monitored with an intensity that, in its own strange way, mirrors the kind of close bodily attention we might associate with rigorous modern healthcare, just built entirely around a mistaken theoretical foundation. His physicians were paying enormously close attention to him. They simply believed the right intervention was drainage and purging rather than washing. There's a genuinely poignant layer to this too, worth sitting with for a moment. Louis suffered from real, documented chronic health problems throughout much of his adult life, including digestive troubles, respiratory issues, and periods of serious illness that would eventually contribute to his relatively early death in his early 40s. It's entirely possible, and several historians have suggested this, that the sheer volume of bloodletting and purging he underwent may have actually worsened his health over time rather than improving it, weakening a body already struggling with genuine underlying conditions, all in the name of careful, well-intentioned medical care. It's a genuinely sobering thought that the era's substitute for hygiene may have done real, measurable harm, even as it was administered with total confidence and sincerity by men who believed themselves to be protecting their king. Picture, then, the strange daily reality of being Louis XIII. Rarely bathed, heavily perfumed, dressed in fresh linen changed multiple times a day, and periodically subjected to bloodletting and purging sessions that would leave modern audiences genuinely wincing. It's a body caught between extraordinary, almost obsessive medical attention and near total neglect of what we'd now consider the most basic elements of physical cleanliness, two systems running in parallel, both operating under the sincere, confident belief that they were doing exactly what royal health required. And with all that blood and purging in mind, it feels only natural to turn next towards something a little closer to the surface, something that would have been immediately unavoidably obvious to anyone standing close enough to speak with the king directly. His teeth, his breath, and the particular social reality of what it actually meant physically to receive a royal audience or even a royal kiss. Remember all that bloodletting and purging we just sat with? The strange substitute hygiene routine performed with such regularity on Louis's body? Now let's move a little closer, right up to the king's face, because there's a part of this story that would have been immediately, unavoidably obvious to anyone standing near enough to actually speak with him: his teeth, and by extension, his breath. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter, and it's one that applied not just to Louis, but to essentially the entire European aristocracy of this period. Dental care in the 17th century was extraordinarily primitive by modern standards, and severe tooth decay, tooth loss, and chronic bad breath were simply universal, unavoidable realities of adult life, regardless of wealth or social status. There was no fluoride, no regular professional cleaning in any form we'd recognise, and refined sugar, increasingly available to wealthy Europeans through expanding trade networks, was wreaking absolute havoc on aristocratic teeth throughout this era. Picture the typical dental hygiene routine of the day because it existed, just in a form that would horrify a modern dentist. Some wealthy individuals use simple tooth cleaning tools, cloths or small brushes made from twigs or animal hair, sometimes combined with abrasive powders made from crushed ingredients like coral, cuttlefish bone, or even brick dust, meant to scrub away visible surface stains. But these tools were used inconsistently, without any real understanding of cavity formation, gum disease, or the bacteria actually responsible for dental decay, combined with diets increasingly rich in sugar for those wealthy enough to afford it. And sugar was, in this era, very much a luxury good, meaning the aristocracy actually suffered worse dental problems on average than poorer populations who simply couldn't afford as much of it. The result was widespread, severe tooth decay among exactly the class of people we might otherwise assume had access to the best care available. Louis himself, according to various historical accounts and the observations of physicians and visitors to his court, suffered from documented dental problems throughout his life, a detail that appears in several contemporary records describing his health more broadly. Given what we know about 17th century dental conditions generally, and the specific medical struggles Louis experienced throughout his life, it's reasonable to assume his own dental health followed a similar trajectory to many of his aristocratic peers: progressive decay, likely tooth loss over time, and the kind of chronic breath issues that would have been simply unavoidable given the available dental technology of the era. Here's a quirky, slightly unsettling tidbit worth sharing. Some historical dental treatments of this period involved practices that sound almost comically extreme to modern ears, including the use of mercury-based compounds to treat various mouth ailments, a substance we now know to be seriously toxic, and various dental repairs that sometimes involve transplanting teeth from other people, including teeth purchased from poorer individuals or even, according to some accounts, extracted from executed criminals or battlefield casualties and implanted into wealthy patients' mouths in an attempt to replace lost teeth. The success rate of these transplants was, unsurprisingly, extremely poor, and the practice carried enormous risk of infection. But the sheer desperation it reveals about how badly wealthy Europeans wanted functional, presentable teeth tells you a great deal about how significant a problem dental decay had become. Historians still argue about exactly how severe Louis's own personal dental problems were, since specific detailed descriptions of a king's mouth were not exactly the kind of thing court chroniclers dwelled on at length in official records, out of both discretion and simple decorum. What we can say with more confidence is that royal audiences and close social interactions during this era would have involved navigating breath and dental conditions that we'd now find genuinely difficult to tolerate, and that courtiers of the time developed their own quiet strategies for managing these encounters, from carefully positioned fans to hold near the face during conversation, to the strategic use of breath-freshening herbs like mint, cloves or aniseed. chewed or held in the mouth before important audiences. There's a fascinating social dimension buried in all of this too. Receiving a royal kiss, or even simply standing close enough to converse directly with the king, was considered an enormous honour in this deeply hierarchical court society, a mark of favour and status that courtiers actively competed for. And yet, given everything we now understand about 17th century dental and hygiene realities, that same intimate physical closeness would have meant experiencing quite directly whatever breath and body odour conditions the king happened to be dealing with at that particular moment. It's a genuinely strange collision of social prestige and physical reality. This idea that the greatest honour available at court also came with, shall we say, certain unavoidable sensory experiences that nobody discussed openly, because discussing them would have been a serious breach of etiquette, even as everyone silently navigated around them. Picture a formal court reception then, dozens of nobles waiting for their turn to approach the king, each one having spent the morning preparing carefully, perfuming themselves, changing into fresh linen, perhaps chewing a bit of mint or clove to freshen their own breath in anticipation of close conversation, while quietly, silently accepting that Lewis's own breath and dental condition were simply part of the package, an unavoidable reality of royal proximity that nobody would ever dream of mentioning aloud, given the enormous social risk of causing offence to the most powerful man in France. And speaking of things nobody discussed openly at court, despite being impossible to fully ignore, it's time we turned our attention to something even more immediate and unavoidable than breath or teeth. The actual physical management of human waste within the walls of a palace that, for all its splendour, had shockingly limited and inconsistent plumbing to deal with it. Remember that mint and clove chewed quietly before royal audiences, that careful social choreography around breath and closeness. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture, the actual physical infrastructure of the palace itself, because for all its gilded ceilings and painted galleries, the honest truth is that royal plumbing during Lewis's reign was shockingly limited, and the management of basic human waste was, frankly, a mess. This is the mainstream historical fact anchoring tonight's chapter. French royal palaces of the early 17th century, including the residences where Louis spent much of his life, lacked anything resembling comprehensive indoor plumbing or sewage systems, and the primary method of waste disposal relied on chamber pots, emptied by servants, and occasionally quite literally dumped out of windows into palace courtyards or moats below. This wasn't unique to France. It reflected the general state of European sanitation technology at the time, but the scale of a royal palace, housing hundreds of courtiers, servants and visitors at any given time, made the problem particularly acute. Picture the actual daily reality of this system. Chamber pots, often beautifully decorated ceramic or metal vessels befitting their aristocratic owners, were used throughout the palace, tucked into bedchambers and private closets, and emptied by dedicated servants whose entire job revolved around this unglamorous but absolutely essential task. In larger palaces, designated areas sometimes existed for more communal waste disposal, but these facilities were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of people living and working within palace walls, and standards of maintenance varied enormously depending on the diligence of the household staff responsible for any given section of the building. Here's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people. The Louvre and other major French royal residences during this general period were documented in various historical accounts and complaints from residents and visitors as suffering from serious ongoing sanitation problems, with waste sometimes accumulating in courtyards, stairwells, and out-of-the-way corners faster than servants could manage it. Visitors and diplomats occasionally wrote home describing the smell of French royal palaces with genuine shock, noting the stark contrast between the visual splendour of painted ceilings and gilded furniture, and the very real, very present odour of accumulated human waste lurking just beneath the surface of that grandeur. This is your quirky, genuinely startling tidbit for tonight. Some historical accounts describe courtiers and visitors relieving themselves in stairwells, behind tapestries, and in secluded corners of palace hallways when chamber pots weren't immediately available or convenient, a practice that apparently became enough of a recognised problem that later French monarchs issued formal decrees attempting to curb it, threatening fines or punishment for anyone caught using palace corridors as an impromptu bathroom. While some of the most dramatic accounts of this practice come from slightly later in the 17th century, historians generally agree the underlying sanitation challenges were already well established during Louis XIII's reign, given the consistent architectural and infrastructural limitations shared across this broader period of French royal building design. Historians still argue about exactly how severe the sanitation situation was during Louis's specific reign versus the reigns of his father and son, since palace populations, building renovations, and staffing levels for waste management all shifted over time, making direct comparisons difficult. Some historians point out that Louis's own household, given his more austere, disciplined personal temperament, may have maintained somewhat stricter standards in his immediate personal quarters compared to the broader palace population, while others note that even the most disciplined individual household couldn't fully insulate itself from the sanitation realities of the larger buildings surrounding it. It's worth thinking for a moment about what this meant practically for someone like Louis, moving through his own palace on any given day. Beyond his immediate private chambers, which would have received more careful, consistent attention from dedicated staff, the broader palace environment involved navigating hallways and public spaces where sanitation conditions could vary dramatically depending on which section of the building you found yourself in, how recently servants had completed their rounds, and how diligently any given area's waste management had been maintained that particular week. Royal life, for all its ceremony and status, still meant existing within a physical building that hadn't yet solved some of the most basic infrastructural challenges we now take entirely for granted. There's also an interesting connection here back to the medical fears we discussed earlier regarding bathing and disease. The same miasma theory that made people fearful of opening their pores to bad air also, somewhat paradoxically, coexisted with genuinely severe environmental sanitation problems that, by any modern understanding, would have posed real and significant disease risks. People were terrified of water opening their skin to invisible bad air, while simultaneously living in close proximity to accumulated waste that, we now know, represented a far more concrete and measurable public health hazard. It's one of the stranger contradictions of this era's medical thinking. Enormous caution applied in one direction, while a genuinely serious sanitation problem persisted largely unaddressed in another, simply because nobody yet understood the actual mechanisms of disease transmission well enough to prioritise correctly. Picture, then, the full sensory environment Louis actually lived within on a daily basis. Heavily perfumed courtiers, fresh but ultimately superficial linen changes, unwashed skin and hair, chronic dental issues, and a palace building itself that, despite its visual grandeur, carried the persistent undertone of inadequately managed human waste throughout many of its hallways and courtyards. It's a far cry from the pristine, golden image popular culture often paints of French royal palaces, and yet it's the genuinely documented physical reality of daily life during this period, one that Louis and everyone around him simply navigated as an unremarkable, unavoidable fact of existence. And having spent this chapter wandering through the palace's less glamorous corners, it feels only natural to turn our attention next to something a little more visible, a little more outwardly presentable. The actual clothing worn atop all of this, and the surprisingly limited role that washing played in maintaining even the most elaborate, expensive garments in Louis's royal wardrobe. Remember those beautifully decorated chamber pots we just left behind, tucked discreetly into palace bedchambers? Let's shift our attention now to something a little more visible, a little more publicly presentable. The actual clothing draped over all of this unwashed reality, because it turns out that even Louis's most elaborate, expensive garments were maintained through a system that involved shockingly little actual washing. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. Outer garments in 17th century French aristocratic fashion, the heavy brocades, velvets, and silks that made up the visible, structured layers of court dress, were almost never washed with water, because the delicate fabrics, elaborate embroidery, and expensive dyes used in their construction simply could not withstand the process without being permanently damaged. Instead, these garments were maintained through brushing, airing out, and careful spot treatment of visible stains, a maintenance approach that prioritised the fabric's appearance and structural integrity over any real deep cleaning. Picture the actual materials involved for a moment, because it helps explain why washing simply wasn't an option. Heavy silk brocade, woven with gold or silver thread, could unravel or lose its shape entirely if submerged in water. Velvet, prized for its rich texture, would be permanently crushed and ruined by any vigorous washing process. Delicate dyes, extracted from expensive natural sources like cochineal insects for deep reds or woad plants for blues, could bleed, fade, or shift colour entirely when exposed to water and the harsh soaps available at the time. Given the enormous cost of these garments, a single elaborate court outfit could represent a substantial fortune, sometimes equivalent to a servant's wages for an entire year or more. Nobody was willing to risk ruining them through improper washing. So instead, maintenance relied on a combination of techniques that sound almost comically inadequate by modern standards, yet were considered perfectly sensible and effective at the time. Garments were regularly brushed to remove surface dust and debris. They were hung and aired out between wearings, sometimes for extended periods, allowing odours to dissipate somewhat naturally rather than being actively removed. Specific stains received careful, targeted spot treatment using various solvents and techniques depending on the type of stain and fabric involved. But this was reactive maintenance rather than any kind of regular comprehensive cleaning routine. Here's a quirky tidbit worth sharing. This is actually where the modern concept of dry cleaning traces some of its earliest conceptual roots, though the actual chemical dry cleaning process we know today wouldn't be developed until centuries later. The underlying philosophy, though, of cleaning garments without fully submerging them in water, treating stains individually rather than washing the entire piece, and relying heavily on airing and brushing as primary maintenance tools, genuinely echoes forward through fashion history in ways that are fascinating to trace, even if the actual 17th century methods were far cruder and less effective than what we'd now recognise as proper garment care. Louis's own royal wardrobe, according to surviving household accounts and inventories from his reign, would have included dozens, if not hundreds, of individual garments, managed by dedicated staff whose job involved this careful brushing, airing and spot treatment routine, along with careful storage designed to protect expensive fabrics from moths, moisture damage and general deterioration between wearings. Wardrobe staff held genuinely important specialised positions within the royal household, their expertise valued precisely because maintaining these enormously expensive garments without ruining them required real skill and careful judgment. Historians still argue about how effectively this brushing and airing system actually managed odour build-up in heavily worn garments over time, particularly for pieces worn repeatedly during hot summer months or extended periods of physical activity like hunting or travel. Some historians point to surviving descriptions from visitors and diplomats noting the distinctive heavy smell of French court clothing as evidence that this system, whatever its intentions, ultimately fell well short of actually managing odour in any meaningful long-term way. Others note that the heavy perfuming practices we discussed earlier likely worked in tandem with clothing maintenance specifically because everyone understood, even if only implicitly, that garment care alone couldn't fully solve the problem, requiring that additional layer of fragrance to bridge the gap. There's an interesting practical wrinkle worth mentioning here too. Undergarments, unlike the heavy outer brocades and velvets, actually could be washed regularly, which is precisely why the linen shirt system we discussed earlier became so central to overall hygiene management. The division of labour was clear and consistent. Washable linen handled the layer closest to skin, doing the actual practical work of absorbing sweat and oil, while unwashable outer garments provided visual splendour and status display, maintained through gentler, non-water-based methods. This two-tier system, dirty but hidden linen doing real work underneath clean-looking but actually unwashed finery on top, captures something genuinely essential about the entire hygiene philosophy of this era. The careful, deliberate separation between what needed to actually function hygienically and what simply needed to look impressive to outside observers. Picture Louis then, fully dressed for a formal court occasion, fresh linen shirt against his skin, doing its quiet, absorbent work, layered beneath an elaborate silk or velvet outer garment that hadn't been washed in months or possibly years, brushed carefully that morning, perhaps lightly perfumed, visually stunning under candlelight, and yet carrying within its fibres the accumulated residue of countless previous wearings. It's a genuinely elaborate system, more thoughtful and considered than the simple "everyone was just dirty" caricature suggests, even if the end result still falls dramatically short of anything we'd recognise as proper hygiene today. And with Louis now fully dressed in his carefully maintained, if not actually clean, court finery, it seems like the right moment to widen our lens a little and step beyond the king himself, out into the broader court around him, where his queen, Anne of Austria, and the wider circle of French nobility were all navigating this exact same fragrant, complicated reality together. Remember that careful two-tier system we just uncovered, washable linen doing the real work underneath unwashable finery on top. That entire system wasn't unique to Louis. It was the shared reality of his whole court, and nowhere is that more interesting to explore than through the figure of his queen, Anne of Austria, and the broader circle of French nobility who navigated this exact same fragrant world alongside him. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. Anne of Austria, Louis's Spanish-born queen, brought with her certain hygiene customs and expectations from the Spanish Habsburg court, which in some respects differed subtly from French practices, and her arrival and integration into French court life offers historians a genuinely useful window into how hygiene customs varied even among closely connected European royal houses of the same general era. Spanish court culture of this period placed somewhat different emphasis on certain aspects of personal presentation, and the blending of these two royal traditions through Anne's marriage to Louis created an interesting cultural negotiation, playing out in something as intimate and personal as bathing and grooming habits. Picture Anne, arriving in France as a young bride, having grown up within an entirely different set of court customs and expectations, now needing to adapt to French aristocratic norms around linen changes, perfuming rituals, and the general medical fears surrounding bathing that dominated her new husband's court. Royal marriages of this era were, of course, primarily political arrangements, rather than personal choices, but they nonetheless required real, practical adaptation on the part of the individuals involved, extending down into daily habits as seemingly mundane as how one manages personal cleanliness. Women's hygiene practices during this period, more broadly, followed many of the same general principles we've discussed for Louis, with a few notable additions specific to female aristocratic presentation. Elaborate hairstyles, often requiring significant time and skill to construct and maintain, meant that washing hair was even less frequent for women than for men, since undoing and reconstructing these elaborate styles required considerable effort from dedicated attendants. Instead, various powders, often made from finely ground starch or other absorbent materials, were used to freshen hair and scalp between the infrequent occasions when actual washing occurred, absorbing oil and masking odour in a method conceptually similar to modern dry shampoo, just considerably cruder in execution. Here's a quirky tidbit that tends to genuinely surprise people. Cosmetics of this era, heavily used by women at court, including likely Anne herself, often contained ingredients we now know to be seriously toxic, including lead-based whitening powders used to achieve the era's fashionable pale complexion. These lead-based cosmetics could cause serious skin damage and health problems with prolonged use, ironically creating exactly the kind of skin irritation and blemishes that women then attempted to cover with even more cosmetic product, a genuinely vicious cycle that historians have documented affecting numerous aristocratic women across several European courts during this general period, though the specific extent of Anne's own personal cosmetic use isn't extensively documented in surviving records. Historians still argue about how much genuine cultural difference actually existed between Spanish and French court hygiene customs during this period, versus how much apparent difference might simply reflect gaps and biases in surviving historical records, since court chroniclers and diplomats often had their own political motivations for emphasising cultural contrasts between rival royal houses. Some historians believe the broader Habsburg court culture, influenced by its geographic connections to regions with slightly different bathing traditions, may have maintained marginally more frequent bathing practices than the French court, while others argue the underlying medical fears about water and disease were shared broadly enough across Catholic European royal houses that any differences were likely quite minor in practice. Beyond the Queen, it's worth picturing the broader court more generally, the dozens and eventually hundreds of nobles who orbited around Louis and Anne throughout their reign, all managing this same complex hygiene system together, creating a kind of unspoken collective agreement about acceptable standards. Etiquette manuals of the period, some of which survive today, offer guidance on court behaviour that indirectly reveals hygiene expectations, discussing appropriate distance to maintain during conversation, proper use of fans and perfumed accessories, and social protocols around physical greetings like kisses or embraces that would have required navigating personal odour and appearance in ways we might now find remarkably delicate and complicated. There's something genuinely fascinating about imagining this shared social contract in action, this collective agreement among hundreds of people that certain physical realities simply wouldn't be acknowledged directly, that the careful performance of cleanliness through fresh linen and heavy perfume would be treated socially as equivalent to actual cleanliness, even though everyone involved presumably understood on some level the gap between appearance and reality. Court life required an enormous amount of this kind of polite collective fiction, extending well beyond hygiene into politics, romance and social status. But the hygiene dimension offers a particularly vivid, almost physically visceral example of just how much shared pretense held this entire elaborate social system together. Picture too the particular pressures facing women at court specifically, who faced even more elaborate and demanding standards of visual presentation than their male counterparts, while working with even fewer practical hygiene tools given the added complexity of elaborate hairstyles and layered structured clothing, designed to create specific fashionable silhouettes. Anne of Austria, as queen, would have faced perhaps the most intense scrutiny of all, her appearance and presentation constantly observed and commented upon by a court eager to find any excuse for political gossip or criticism, adding real social stakes to what might otherwise seem like purely personal grooming choices. And having now widened our view to take in the whole court, queen and courtiers alike, all navigating this same complicated, fragrant reality together, it's worth stepping back a bit further still to understand how all of this hygiene behaviour connected to something even larger looming over the entire century, the genuine recurring terror of plague and disease that shaped so much of this era's relationship with illness, superstition, and the deep persistent fear of water itself. Remember that quiet collective agreement we just uncovered among Lewis's courtiers, this shared social fiction that let an entire palace function despite everyone's unwashed reality. To really understand why that fiction held together so tightly for so long, we need to step back and look at the genuine terror simmering beneath it all, the recurring spectre of plague, and the way it shaped an entire century's relationship with illness, superstition, and water itself. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. Plague outbreaks recurred throughout Louis's lifetime, and the broader 17th century across Europe, killing with a speed and brutality that left lasting psychological marks on how people understood disease, and this recurring trauma directly reinforced and hardened the medical theories that discouraged bathing in the first place. Major outbreaks struck various French cities and regions during Louis's reign, and the collective memory of previous devastating plague waves, including the catastrophic outbreaks of earlier centuries, remained vivid and immediate in the cultural consciousness of everyone living through this period. Picture what it actually meant to live with this kind of recurring, unpredictable threat looming constantly in the background. Unlike our modern relationship with disease, where we understand germ theory, transmission vectors, and can develop targeted treatments and vaccines, 17th century Europeans faced plague with essentially no reliable understanding of its actual cause. Theories abounded, mixing genuine observation with superstition and inherited medical tradition in ways that, from our modern vantage point, look like a fascinating but ultimately tragic patchwork of near misses and complete misunderstandings. Miasma theory, the idea that disease travelled through bad air arising from decay, swamps, and unclean conditions, dominated much of this thinking, and it connected directly, as we discussed earlier, to fears about opening the body's pores through bathing. Here's the connective thread worth really sitting with. If you believe disease travels primarily through bad air entering the body via open pores, then avoiding anything that opens those pores becomes a genuinely rational, even urgent survival strategy. Bathing, particularly in hot water, was believed to open pores wide, creating exactly the kind of vulnerability that could allow plague-carrying bad air to enter the bloodstream directly. This wasn't an abstract theoretical fear removed from daily life. This was a survival strategy developed and reinforced by generations who had watched plague sweep through communities, killing indiscriminately, with seemingly little pattern or logic that contemporary medicine could actually explain or predict. You can imagine, then, just how deeply entrenched bathing avoidance became, not as simple habit or laziness, but as genuine, felt fear, passed down through families and reinforced by every new outbreak that swept through French cities during Lewis's own lifetime. Parents taught children to avoid water, not out of casual preference, but out of real, visceral terror, the same kind of deep protective instinct we might now apply to genuinely dangerous modern threats. It's worth remembering this when we're tempted to simply laugh at the era's hygiene practices from our comfortable modern distance. These were people making what felt like genuinely life-or-death decisions with the best information available to them at the time. Here's a quirky, genuinely fascinating tidbit worth sharing. Plague doctors of this era developed their now iconic beaked masks, specifically based on miasma theory, filling the beak portion with strong-smelling herbs, flowers, and substances believed to filter out the bad air responsible for spreading disease. This same underlying logic, the belief that strong scent could provide genuine physical protection against airborne disease, connects directly back to the heavy perfuming practices we discussed several chapters ago. Perfume wasn't purely about masking body odour for social comfort. On some level, for at least some people during this era, it may have carried genuine, sincere hope of actual medical protection against disease, blurring the line between vanity and survival instinct in a way that's genuinely poignant to consider. Historians still argue about exactly how much the recurring plague threat specifically reinforced bathing avoidance versus how much this connection has been somewhat overstated or simplified in popular historical retellings, since the actual medical literature of the period involves considerably more nuance and internal debate among physicians than a simple, unified anti-bathing consensus might suggest. Some scholars point out that certain physicians and medical writers of this broader era did continue to recommend limited, careful bathing for specific medical purposes, suggesting the picture was somewhat more varied and contested than popular narratives sometimes present, even as the dominant mainstream medical opinion clearly leans strongly toward caution and avoidance. What's genuinely striking, looking back at this period, is how much genuine fear and care underlay practices that look, from our modern perspective, almost willfully unhygienic. Louis and his court weren't simply indifferent to cleanliness or health. They were, in their own context, deeply and sincerely preoccupied with health, disease prevention, and survival, channeling that preoccupation through a medical framework that tragically pointed them in exactly the wrong direction on this particular issue, even while getting other things like basic quarantine practices during active outbreaks reasonably right by instinct if not by full scientific understanding. Picture, then, the psychological weight Louis and everyone around him carried through daily life. This constant low hum of disease anxiety, shaping decisions about water, about scent, about how closely to stand near others, about which parts of the body needed protecting and how. It adds a genuinely different emotional texture to this whole story, doesn't it? This recognition that behind the powdered wigs and perfumed gloves sat real people, navigating real, persistent fear with the tools their century had given them. And it's precisely this backdrop of disease anxiety and medical caution that makes Lewis's own declining health in his later years feel particularly worth examining closely, because his personal illnesses and the treatments applied to manage them reveal so much about how deeply intertwined hygiene, medicine, and mortality had become by the final years of his reign. Remember that constant low hum of disease anxiety we just sat with, shaping so much of daily royal life? As Louis moved into his later years, that anxiety stopped being abstract background noise and became something much more immediate and personal, because his own health began a slow, well-documented decline that intertwined directly with the hygiene practices and medical treatments we've been tracing throughout tonight's story. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. Louis suffered from a range of chronic health problems throughout his adult life, including digestive issues, respiratory difficulties, and periods of serious illness, and he ultimately died in 1643 at just 41 years old, following a prolonged final illness that historians generally attribute to complications from intestinal tuberculosis, compounded significantly by the aggressive medical treatments applied throughout his life, including the extensive bloodletting and purging we discussed earlier. His relatively early death, even by the standards of an era with generally lower life expectancy than our own, reflects a genuinely difficult final chapter, one where the era's medical and hygiene practices arguably contributed to, rather than alleviated, his suffering. Picture Louis in his final years, a king whose physical health had clearly been declining for some time, surrounded by physicians who responded to this decline with exactly the tools their medical training had given them: more bloodletting, more purging, more careful management of humours and fluids, all administered with total sincerity and genuine belief that these interventions represented the very best care available. Surviving accounts from this final period of his life describe a body increasingly weakened, not just by underlying illness, but plausibly by the sheer cumulative weight of these interventions themselves. A body that had been drained, purged, and medically managed for decades, finally reaching a breaking point that no amount of further bloodletting could reverse. Here's a genuinely poignant detail worth sitting with. Some historical accounts from Lewis's final illness describe truly extraordinary numbers of medical interventions administered in his last months and weeks alive, with some estimates suggesting dozens of bloodletting and purging sessions occurring in just the final period before his death, as increasingly desperate physicians attempted every tool available to them to save their dying king. You can imagine the scene, physicians working with total dedication and genuine desperation, applying treatments that we now understand were almost certainly worsening rather than helping his condition, weakening an already failing body through continued blood loss and digestive disruption, all in the sincere, misguided pursuit of restoring humoral balance. This is your quirky, genuinely fascinating tidbit for this section. Louis reportedly requested during his final illness that his young son and heir, the future Louis XIV, be brought to visit him, and several historical accounts describe the dying king offering advice and blessings to the child who would go on to become the longest reigning monarch in recorded European history, ruling France for over 70 years and becoming the legendary Sun King. There's something genuinely moving about this connection, this image of a king whose own reign had been shaped so thoroughly by the medical limitations and hygiene fears of his era, passing the throne to a successor who would go on to reshape French court culture in ways that included eventually somewhat different, though still far from modern, approaches to royal hygiene and personal presentation. Historians still argue about exactly how much Lewis's aggressive medical treatment specifically hastened his death, versus how much his underlying illness would have proven fatal regardless of the specific interventions applied, since intestinal tuberculosis, if that diagnosis is accurate, represented a genuinely serious condition with limited treatment options available under any 17th century medical framework. Some historians emphasize the likely harm caused by excessive bloodletting specifically, pointing to modern medical understanding of how blood loss can weaken an already compromised immune system and cardiovascular function, while others caution against applying modern medical hindsight too heavily onto a historical situation where physicians were working with the absolute best information and tools available to them at the time, doing everything within their power, as they understood it, to help their king. It's worth pausing here to connect this back to everything we've discussed throughout tonight's story. Lewis's entire relationship with his own body, from infancy through to his final illness, was shaped by a consistent medical philosophy that prioritized managing internal fluids and humours over external cleanliness, that feared water while embracing bloodletting, that trusted linen changes over actual bathing, and that ultimately, in his final months, applied that same underlying philosophy with increasing intensity, even as his body grew weaker rather than stronger under its influence. There's a strange, tragic consistency running through his entire life story, this same medical worldview present at his birth and present again at his death, never fundamentally questioned or revised despite decades of evidence, at least by modern standards, suggesting its core assumptions were deeply flawed. Picture too the broader emotional atmosphere within the palace during these final weeks, the hushed corridors, the careful management of who could see the king and when, the genuine grief building among courtiers and family members who understood, even without modern medical knowledge, that this decline felt different, more serious, more final than previous illnesses Louis had weathered throughout his reign. Court life, for all its elaborate hygiene fictions and perfume distractions, still ultimately revolved around very real, very human experiences of illness, mortality, and loss, experiences that no amount of scent or ceremony could fully soften or disguise. And as we sit with the genuine sadness of Lewis's final months, weakened by the very medical philosophy meant to protect him, it feels worth widening our perspective one more time before we begin easing toward tonight's close, to place Lewis's particular hygiene story alongside some of history's other famously unwashed monarchs, and to understand just how typical, or perhaps atypical, his particular relationship with cleanliness actually was among the broader sweep of European royal history. Remember that quiet, grieving palace we just left? Courtiers watching their king's final decline with real, unguarded sadness beneath all the ceremony? Before we settle fully into tonight's closing chapters, it's worth widening our lens one more time, stepping back from Louis specifically to place him alongside some of history's other notably unwashed monarchs, because it turns out he's far from alone in this particular corner of royal history. This is the mainstream historical fact for tonight's chapter. Several other prominent European monarchs across roughly this same broader era have similarly documented reputations for minimal bathing and heavy reliance on perfume, powder, and linen-based hygiene systems, suggesting Lewis's habits, rather than representing some unusual personal eccentricity, actually reflected fairly standard practice among European royalty, operating under similar medical assumptions about water and disease. Queen Elizabeth I of England, reigning roughly contemporary to Lewis's father and the early years of Lewis's own life, is famously, though somewhat debatably, associated with claims about infrequent bathing. Though historians note her actual habits may have been somewhat more moderate than popular legend suggests. Later French monarchs, including Lewis's own son, Louis XIV, and grandson adjacent successors, continued grappling with many of these same hygiene questions throughout the following century, even as attitudes gradually began shifting. Picture the broader European royal landscape during this period as a kind of shared cultural ecosystem. Courts, across different nations exchanging ambassadors, arranging marriages, and generally maintaining close diplomatic and social contact with one another, which meant hygiene customs, medical theories, and fashion trends often spread and cross-pollinated across national boundaries. A physician trained in one country's medical tradition might well end up serving a royal household in another, carrying with him the same fundamental humoral theories and bathing fears regardless of which specific monarch he happened to be treating. This helps explain why we see such remarkably similar patterns repeating across different royal courts throughout this general era, from France to England to Spain and beyond. Here's a quirky, genuinely fun tidbit worth sharing. Louis XIV, Louis XIII's own son and successor, who would go on to rule France for over 70 remarkable years, reportedly bathed only a handful of times across his entire adult life, according to various historical accounts, relying instead on the same general system of linen changes and heavy perfuming that we've traced throughout his father's story tonight. Some historical accounts suggest the Sun King himself found the very idea of bathing somewhat frightening or unpleasant, having been raised within this same medical tradition that treated water with such persistent suspicion. This continuity across generations, from Louis XIII through to his famous son, really underscores just how deeply entrenched these beliefs had become within French royal culture specifically, persisting for decades even as some other parts of European society very gradually began questioning and revising these medical assumptions. Historians still argue about exactly how to compare hygiene practices across different royal courts, since surviving records vary enormously in detail and reliability depending on which monarch and which country we're examining, and popular historical legend has, in some cases, exaggerated or distorted the actual documented reality considerably beyond what surviving evidence can really support. Some historians caution strongly against treating colourful anecdotes about royal filth as fully reliable, noting that many popular stories about famously unwashed monarchs originated generations after the fact, sometimes deliberately exaggerated by later writers looking to create a more dramatic, entertaining historical narrative than the more mundane documented reality actually supports. Others argue that even accounting for likely exaggeration, the underlying pattern, genuine widespread bathing avoidance rooted in real, sincere medical theory, remains solidly well documented and historically accurate across multiple independent courts and countries. It's worth thinking for a moment about why this particular aspect of royal history tends to capture popular imagination so persistently, generating exactly the kind of colourful, sometimes exaggerated stories historians have to carefully sift through centuries later. There's something genuinely fascinating, even a little comforting in a strange way, about learning that even the most powerful, wealthy people in history, monarchs commanding armies and controlling vast territories, were still bound by the same basic physical realities and medical limitations as everyone else around them. Power and wealth, it turns out, could buy elaborate perfumes and endless fresh linen, but they couldn't buy actual modern medical understanding, couldn't purchase germ theory a couple centuries before it would actually be discovered, couldn't simply will away the fundamental constraints of 17th century knowledge, regardless of how much gold sat in the royal treasury. Picture too how this broader pattern connects back to something we touched on earlier in tonight's story, the way ordinary people across Europe, lacking access to royal-level perfumes and endless linen supplies, likely experienced even more pronounced body odour and hygiene challenges than the aristocracy, even as the aristocracy's own careful, expensive systems ultimately achieved only partial, surface-level success at managing the same fundamental problem. Hygiene during this era existed along a spectrum shaped heavily by wealth and access, but even at the very top of that spectrum, even for a king, the actual physical reality remained a world away from anything we'd recognise as clean today. And now, having placed Louis firmly within this broader context of European royal hygiene history, understanding that his habits reflected genuine, widespread patterns rather than unusual personal failing, it feels like exactly the right moment to begin gently drawing tonight's story toward its close, taking a little time to separate historical fact from popular myth and exaggeration before we ease all the way down into sleep together. Remember that broader European landscape of unwashed monarchs we just wandered through, Louis standing alongside so many others shaped by the same medical fears. As we settle now into this final chapter of tonight's story, let's take a slow, gentle moment to sort through what's genuinely documented fact, what's reasonable historical inference, and what has, over the centuries, drifted a little further into exaggeration and popular legend. This is the mainstream historical fact worth settling on as we close. The core elements of tonight's story, the humoral medical theory discouraging bathing, the reliance on linen changes and heavy perfume as substitutes for water-based hygiene, the widespread presence of lice and other parasites, the primitive dental care, and the aggressive bloodletting and purging treatments Louis endured throughout his life, are all genuinely well documented across multiple independent historical sources, supported by surviving physicians' records, household account books, and the writings of contemporaries who lived through and directly observed this era. This isn't speculation or invention. It's a real, carefully reconstructed picture of daily royal life, pieced together patiently by historians working through archives, letters, and financial records that have survived the intervening centuries. At the same time, it's worth acknowledging gently as we wind down that some of the more dramatic, colourful, specific anecdotes that circulate in popular retellings of this era, some of the more startling individual numbers and vivid specific stories, deserve a bit more caution and nuance than they sometimes receive in casual conversation or quick online summaries. Historians continue working patiently and carefully through incomplete records, sometimes finding that a popular, oft-repeated historical claim traces back to a single, possibly exaggerated source, or a later writer's dramatic embellishment rather than solid contemporary documentation. This is simply the nature of history itself, isn't it? This careful, ongoing process of sorting signal from noise, fact from legend, working with imperfect surviving evidence to build the most honest picture possible, while always remaining humble and open to revision as new evidence or new scholarly analysis emerges. What remains genuinely, solidly true, regardless of exactly which specific numbers or anecdotes prove most reliable, is the bigger picture we've spent this whole story exploring together. That Louis XIII lived within a medical and cultural framework that treated water with real, sincere fear, that channeled hygiene efforts into linen, perfume and powder rather than actual washing, and that applied aggressive, invasive medical treatments as a kind of parallel system of bodily care, all administered with genuine belief and good intention, even as it strikes us now from our comfortable modern distance, as almost the exact opposite of what we'd now consider healthy or hygienic. There's something worth sitting with gently as we close tonight's journey about how this story reflects something larger than just one king's particular habits. It's really a story about how deeply our understanding of health and cleanliness depends on the scientific knowledge available to us at any given moment in history, how sincerely, carefully intentioned people can still cause real harm when working from mistaken foundational assumptions, and how much genuine care and attention Lewis's physicians poured into treatments that we now understand were likely doing more harm than good. It's a humbling thought, in its own quiet way, a reminder that confidence and good intentions, however genuine, aren't always the same thing as actually being right, and that real wisdom often means holding our own current certainties a little more loosely than we might otherwise be tempted to. And now, as we've wandered together through Lewis's birth and childhood, through his physicians and their careful, misguided theories, through perfume and linen and lice, through his own personal temperament and his final, difficult decline, and through the broader landscape of European royal hygiene surrounding him, It feels like exactly the right moment to let this story settle, gently, into rest alongside you. So let your shoulders soften now, wherever you're lying, however you're tucked in tonight. Let the image of that grand, gilded, surprisingly fragrant palace fade slowly from view, its candlelit halls growing quiet, its corridors emptying, its perfumed courtiers drifting off one by one to their own rest, just as you are drifting now toward yours. Somewhere in that palace, a king who spent his whole life caught between careful medical caution and genuine physical neglect, finally, after everything, gets to rest too, and so do you. There's no need to hold on to any of these details tightly. Let the specific numbers, the bloodletting counts, the linen inventories, the perfume recipes, drift gently away, like smoke rising from a candle just before it's snuffed out. What matters now isn't remembering every fact precisely. What matters is simply this quiet, unhurried moment, this soft descent towards sleep, your breathing slowing, your mind loosening its grip on the day, on the story, on everything except this gentle, present stillness. You're safe here, warm here, far away from plague fears and bloodletting basins and unwashed linen. You're simply here, now, wrapped in whatever softness surrounds you, letting this long, strange, oddly tender journey through history settle quietly into the background, like a lullaby fading into silence. Rest now. Let your thoughts grow slow and soft and a little blurred around the edges, the way thoughts do right before sleep finally, gently arrives. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Nothing else you need to hold on to. Just this quiet dark, this soft hum, this slow, easy drift downward into rest. Sleep well, you night owls. Sleep deeply, sleep gently, and I'll see you again next time. End of script. Sweet dreams.